So Professor Mehta is a developmental economist and an associate professor of global studies at UCSB. He studies employment patterns around the world, their relationship with globalization, and their implications for equitable development through education and work. Today, he'll be speaking on major restrictions and social stratification in the UC system and beyond. If you have any questions throughout the talk, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll moderate them and ask him at the end during the Q&A session. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the chat as well. So Professor Mehta, go ahead.
All right, well, thank you all for taking time out to come and watch this. And it's so nice to see so several of you former students out there. And yeah, okay, so I guess you're back for more. Let me start. I'm gonna share my screen. Hang on, where'd it go? Sorry, I'll just get past the usual Zoom nonsense and be right with you. Hang on, share screen. There we have it. Okay, so this is work I've had the pleasure of doing with Zach Bleemer. Zach is just finishing his PhD at UC Berkeley in economics. And he's also been working for the last few years while he does it at Ucop, and has put together an amazing volume of data for Ucop, covering student records, all kinds of campus records that allow us to actually bring some visibility to some really important issues that I hope I'll convince you we all need to be thinking about very hard as we think about kind of how the university operates and what we do going forward. So this is joint work with Zach. And let me just jump in. I've got 20 minutes, 25 maybe, to get this across. And as those of you who know me would expect, I've got lots of graphs I've got to show you. So here we go. Okay. So as far as the words go, I'll define words as we go. So let me not start with the obligatory synopsis. I'll just tell you a story. Okay? And I'm going to start by telling you some good news. So I'm interested here in what the UC is doing and what UCSB in particular is doing for social mobility, for socioeconomic mobility, right? And so reducing stratification by race and by class. That's one of the goals of public universities. And as I'm going to show you, the news isn't great on this front, but I want to start with the news that is good on this front. And here's the good news. So if you start with, on your left here, right, you've got UC-wide enrollments by race, and it should be pretty clear that the UC is doing a really good job of enrolling a growing number of underrepresented minority students. Underrepresented minority is Hispanic Latino. Below that, there's this thin line, which is Native American, and below that is African American. Right? And so we've increased the fraction of our students enrolling on our campuses who are underrepresented minorities, and that's all to the good. Not only are we enrolling them in growing numbers, we're actually doing a very good job of graduating them. So in this graph on the right, we're comparing now not underrepresented minorities, but we're looking at Pell Grant recipients. So Pell Grant receipt is a proxy for coming from a lower income household. And you can see that relative to most universities, right, the CSUs and the UCs are really good at serving Pell Grant students. We serve a lot of them. And compared to the CSUs, the UCs are unusually good at getting them to graduate. Okay, so we're helping a large and growing number of students over the threshold from being a high school graduate to being a college graduate, and then deriving all the benefits that come from that. So that's super important and not to be forgotten. Okay. Now, the question is, how well are we doing it, right? So we're delivering a lot more service to a lot more people. What's happening to the quality of the service? And that's where I want to raise some questions and point to some systemic issues. Okay, so the systemic problems really begin with funding. So the UCs in the 1930s, 80% of our budget came from the state. That number has shrunk dramatically, right? By 1987, we were getting $25,000 per student from the state. By 2015, that number's down to 10,000. So it's a big drop. I'll also note that we made up for some of that shortfall by jacking up tuition. Of course, tuition puts students then on the hook for coming up with a lot of that money. And the increases in tuition did not offset completely the decline in state funding, so that total funding per student actually went down. It's come up a bit, but it's still down compared to where it was. And this is, of course, all happening at a time when we have a set of students that is increasingly showing up on our campuses who is trying to make up for lacuna in high school, right? As we democratize college, it means that we're getting people who went to less well-funded high schools, some of them less well-equipped for college, many of them working multiple jobs to get through college. There's a lot of difficulty associated with that, and we should be spending more money on these students, not less. But we're now spending less than we used to. And that starts to have some implications for quality. So if you think about the pedagogical resources, so using these data that we got, we went through and we said, okay, for every student who's come through 4 campuses since the early 2000s, we know everything about which classes they took, what grades they got, et cetera. Of course, we don't know their names, right? This is anonymized. And so the first thing we figured out was, well, what was their median class size? So the median class size of the typical UCSB student in 2000 was 73 students in the class. By 2016, that median class size is up to 111. Okay, so it's gone up by around 50%. That's not good news. Now, some people would look at this and say, well, okay, that's fine, but you know, we're a public university. We have this model of these very large classes, these big lecture halls, and we back it up with TAs in discussion sections. And so if we just expanded that, the numbers would go up, but it wouldn't really adversely affect pedagogy very much. So to deal with that concern, we went ahead and collected data on all the class sizes in Stanford, because Stanford is a university that doesn't suffer our funding problems and presumably teaches classes at the sizes that faculty think are pedagogically appropriate. We compared each of our classes to an appropriate comparison class in Stanford, and what we found was that our classes in 2000 were 47% larger than their Stanford counterparts. And by 2016, they were 71% larger. So this is not about a shift in the composition of our classes. This is essentially about our classes getting bigger for no reason other than they must. We increasingly find, and I think many of you who are recent graduates will sympathize with this, you'll have been through this, students increasingly unable to access electives outside their majors. As departments, we frequently have to debate the benefits of letting students in who are truly interested but not in the major. And our staff tell us you can't let them in, because if you let them in, then students who need the class to graduate, complete their major, won't be able to do it. And so we increasingly don't allow that kind of intellectual cross-fertilization. There are popular minors that have been shelved because faculty are now required to spend their time teaching courses to majors that majors need to graduate. And the share of UCSB graduates who complete more than one major has fallen from 14% in 2004 to 9% in 2016. Okay? And this is at a campus that when I first joined in 2007, I was told was, you know, our niche was that we were the interdisciplinary campus. Okay? So the point I want to make here is that the budget cuts are crippling, and the loss of pedagogical resources is reducing not just the quality of what we can deliver in class, but also the amount of choice that students have. Okay. Now, I'm going to be talking about a mechanism that makes that happen. That's the major restriction. I'll talk about that in a bit. And I'm also going to be talking a lot today about stratification. So let's just have a working definition. So stratification is, I mean, the simple way to say this is it's about being separate and unequal, right? So if there's an inequality of experience across units, today you can think about the units as being majors or you see campuses, and there is some inequality in the resources available or that kind of educational experience is available across them. And if on top of that, the likelihood that a person is going to be able to access what they would consider the more appropriate or the higher quality unit is correlated with a race, class, or ethnicity, we'd say we got a society that's stratified. Okay? And the worse this gets, the more stratified we are. So just to give you one sort of quick example of what this might look like, right? So we all know that the top 10%, I think now maybe 12% of California high school graduates ensured a spot at a UC. We don't say which UC. So if you're in the top 10% of a not very good high school, the chances are you're going to end up at Merced. And if you've had a superb education, the chances are you're going to end up at Berkeley. What you see happening then, right, is that race plays a role in, at least statistically, in predicting where you're going to end up. So Merced has rapidly become the Hispanic and the underrepresented minority campus, whereas with 60% of its students being underrepresented minorities, while Berkeley remains at about 20%. And it is also the case that if you think about a range of resources that are available, that Berkeley basically offers its students more opportunities than Merced can, right? You can look at the wages between them, and you can see that Berkeley graduates typically tend to be off to a better start in life. I'm going to caution you against thinking that if you went to Berkeley instead of Merced, you make $30,000 more. That's not how you should think about these numbers. But I would take from these numbers the idea that the Berkeley grad has more choices than the Merced grad. Okay. And so we have stratification. We have a clear separation. Race plays a role in where you end up. And we have an inequality across the units. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of work done on stratification across universities, about how Ivy League universities don't let in working class kids. There's been about the role of selectivity, about the role of the SATs in creating stratification, et cetera. We know about all that. What hasn't been well studied is stratification within universities. Once you get to a campus, right, what is the role of race and class in influencing what you will actually be able to study, what kind of learning experiences, and thereafter earning experiences your college experience will allow you to access. And so that's the story I want to build, and I'm going to tell it mainly with reference to UCSB, some data from the UC system, and I will allude to some charts we've been working on that show that this is a problem not just in the UC system, but in public universities nationwide. So I'm going to kind of keep zooming this way and that way to make sure that the story becomes clear. But I don't believe that what we're seeing at UC is unique. All right, so let's take a look at what happened at UCSB. Okay, I've already talked about how we've been more reliant on tuition, and student debt has been rising. And partly as a consequence of that, and partly as a consequence of a national discourse around STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, there's been something of an obsession with getting into STEM fields. Okay? Now, I'm not going to tell you whether it's good, bad, indifferent. It's just a thing. It's a fact. And so what we have seen over time is students voting with their feet, right? In absolute numbers, we have fewer humanities majors now than we used to in the past. Students still continue to take lots of humanities classes because intellectually they know that this is important and interesting, but they're not declaring the majors like they used to. And they all, first choice that people moved into was STEM, second choice was social sciences. Okay. So that's the story. And I'd also note one curious thing that happened. Sometime around graduation year 2011, suddenly the number of people majoring in STEM fields starts to go down, even while the national mania for STEM continues. The one thing that we still need to do on our research is fully quantitatively explain what happened. So what I'm going to do is speculate I'm going to speculate that what drove this down was the increased use of major restrictions in STEM fields. But I reiterate, that is a speculation. I cannot back it yet. Okay, it's just an educated guess. Let me show you now what happens. So if you're running a department and students are flocking to your department in ever larger numbers, and you don't have the ramp up in faculty and staff that you need to accommodate them, what are you going to do? Okay, well, public universities and the most high demand majors at public universities many of them have started to use major restrictions. So what a major restriction is one of the following things, right? So we've got here 26 of the top ranked as per US News and World Report public universities, and 5 of the quote unquote highest paying majors, okay? These are the ones that tend to be in high demand, and each of these majors either require, to get into it, either you have to apply while you're in the university, and so we've noted that with an A, or you have to make a certain GPA in your introductory classes, right? In which case we have reported what that GPA is. So there's either a GPA cap or an internal application, or the HS is you've got to apply straight out of high school to get in, okay? The only ones that are unrestricted are the ones that are blanks. The asterisk majors don't exist, okay? So the majority of the high-paying majors at public universities use major restrictions, and this phenomenon hasn't been studied. So we thought we really better get on with this, right? Okay. Now, what does a major restriction do? Okay. So to try and get at that, what we've done is we've taken data on many majors, all the majors actually, at 4 UC campuses over time. Okay, and each of these major restrictions got introduced at particular moments in time, different moments in time at different campuses. And so we're comparing in figure 3 here, I apologize, we're comparing the enrollments, the number of students, right, that end up declaring the major, right, relative to the numbers of students declaring all the other majors that are not restricted in the years before, right when the restriction is declared, and the years after the restriction is declared. And you start to see a very clear pattern, right? So basically about 6 years before the major restriction is imposed, the typical department that imposes a restriction is seeing a ramp up in the number of students, right? The number of students majoring in this field goes up by 20%. You get to the time where you say, okay, we've had enough, we can't take it, we're going to impose a major restriction. And then in the years after, within 4 years after that, the number of students majoring in this field declines by 20%. So it really has all the appearances of a quantitative control mechanism. It's just directing traffic. But it isn't neutral in how it does it, right? Remember that what these major restrictions are doing is saying you've got to make certain grades in your freshman classes in order to get into the major. And if you can't, you've got to go take another major. Well, if you've gone to a bad high school, right? And by bad, I simply mean one that isn't as well endowed as the ones that some of your classmates have gone to. It doesn't have the AP physics classes. It doesn't have the computer labs. It may not have the best math teachers, etc. It's going to be pretty hard for you to catch up and do well in these competitive first-year classes, and so you're likely to get booted out. And that's what we see happening, is underrepresented minority students disproportionately are the ones that fail to make it over these bars and are getting removed from the majors, right? And so the composition of the major becomes less URM heavy, right? So underrepresented minority students are not able to major in these subjects, okay? So there's about a 3 percentage point drop in the share of students who are underrepresented minorities against a baseline of about 15%, which means that we're talking on the order of about a fifth, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of students who want to take these subjects are probably getting kicked out of them if they're underrepresented minorities. So the first thing, I could stop there, and it should be clear that we're offering different choices to different students depending on their socioeconomic backgrounds. That is a problem in and of itself, right? If you come to university wanting to study the things you want to study and you can't study the thing you want to study, that's an inferior education already. But it's worse than that. Okay. Now, I've talked about high wage majors and said, don't take the idea of a high wage major that seriously. So for example, if you came to college thinking that you wanted to major in art history, became worried about your financial prospects, and looked around and found some statistics that said that people who major in economics on average have higher salaries, that should not tell you that if you switch from art history to economics, your salary is going to go up. We have no evidence of that whatsoever. And nothing that I'm going to tell you suggests that that is true. And as far as I know, there is not an academic paper out there that says that that is true. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. It's that the people who major in economics choose to major in economics. They may be people who, by dint of who they are, what interests them, perhaps they're interested in money, perhaps they have social connections. These may be people who would make more money regardless of what they major in. We just don't know. Because people self-select, you cannot compare wages across majors typically and say, if I major in X, I'll make more money than if I major in Y. Okay? So we don't really know the answer to that. What is the benefit to switching out of a major you're interested in into another one whose average wages are higher that you're not interested in? I'll never answer that question. I don't know, but I can give you the answer to a different question. If you came into UC Santa Cruz between 2008 and 2012, and you said, I want to major in economics, and you got kicked out by their pre-major restriction, it would cost you. Okay, so here's how we know this, right? So we took UC Santa Cruz at this time had this GPA requirement. You had to get a 2.75 on Econ 1 and 2 GPA in order to qualify automatically for the major. So those who got more than 2.75 in those first two classes, 80% of them became economics majors, right? The other 20% maybe decided they weren't interested and just didn't do it. If you fail to make the 2.75, you can petition. Of the ones who just failed to make it, 40% of them must have petitioned and became economics majors. So crossing this threshold gets you a 40% bump in the probability of majoring in economics. And crossing that, right? And the people just on either side of this bump, one who got a 2.8 on the exam, one who got a 2.7 on the exams, these are basically the same people. Just
a personal thing, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what we'll be doing.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Okay. So anyway, we got the same people, basically comparable people, one on either side. And these ones have a 40% higher chance of becoming economics majors. Their average wages go up by $8,000 a year, 5 years out of, or yeah, 3 to 5 years out of college. So what we impute from that is that if a 40% increase in the probability of being an economics major is associated with an $8,000 wage bump, then a 100% increase in the probability of being an economics major is associated with a $22,000 wage bump. Okay, conditional on being somebody who would be in our sample in the first place. That is somebody who's interested in economics, interested enough to take these two classes. Okay, and so if we systematically go around saying to students, we know you're interested in the subject, but you didn't make the cutoff, you're out, go pick a different major, we're pretty sure this hurts them, right? We've shown it with economics. With other majors, all we have is the observational wage differences, and we know that they're big. And there's probably a similar process underlying it. So we think it's not just unfair, not just deprive students of choice, but it actually leads to less equality of economic opportunity. And then we've said, okay, how do we test the mechanism? How do we test what's actually going on? How are these students getting selected in and out of these majors? So we made a comparison now between UCSB and UC Davis, right? Both campuses have economics majors, a few different ones. The majors are pretty similarly structured, but the UCSB one is restricted. You've got to make grades in Econ 1 and 2 and some calculus classes and an Econ 10A if you want to get in. And so we can make a simple comparison between them. And what we find is that the probability of actually getting to the point where you can declare an economics major at UCSB is more race and class dependent than it is at Davis, right? And then we dig deeper to say what explains the differences, run a whole bunch of regressions. And what we're finding is that it's students with high quality K through 12 education that were more likely to make the grades that UCSB requires in Calc and introductory economics. That's who's getting in. And once you correct for the quality of K through 12 education, most of this evidence of racial stratification is explained away. So this is what's doing it. This is the mechanism, okay? So far what we've established is that major restrictions are bad and they stratify. I just want to show you for a couple of minutes a little bit of evidence that this stratification problem is even bigger than that and extends further than these few majors that we've selected because we can really causally identify what's happening. So first, let me show you that UCSB is separate. Remember, stratification is separate plus unequal. Here's separate. If you look at the probability that a randomly selected student in any of the divisions is an underrepresented minority student, that percentage is much lower in the STEM fields than it is in the non-STEM fields. And it is true, although to a lesser extent, for lower income students as well. Okay, so the STEM fields are not taking as many of these students as social sciences and humanities. That's separate, but what about separate and unequal? How do we show that stratification? So now what we did was we said, let's start out by ascribing to every major a wage, right? So for any given major, we'll say, what's the average wage earned by Californians at the age of 40 with that major? And then we do that for each major, and then we record for each student, given the major they came out of, we'll impute for them that wage. And so we say, if you got the average wage of your major, what would be the average wages that we would predict underrepresented minority students at UCSB would make in 2003, and what's the average wage you predict that non-underrepresented minority students at UCSB would make just based on their major choices. And so we see a gap of about $1,700 in 2003 that opens up to about $4,500 by the time we get to 2016. So we're becoming more separate and unequal, more stratified. Okay. We then said, okay, that's earning, what about learning? So we then took data on the access to instructional resources that the departments offering those majors have, and we did the same thing. And what we found was that by 2016, the departments hosting the URM students' likely majors got 11% less money per credit unit than those hosting non-URM students' likely majors. Now, given that we don't have a complete separation of the students, this means that the differences in instructional funding are actually much, much, much bigger than that between departments. And the gap was 0 in 1999. So we got a problem and it's growing. Finally, we wanted to think about sort of the full range of what are the sorts of things that happen in the classroom, how different are they? Now, there's not one good metric for it, but here's a metric that loosely gets at all of this kind of stuff, which is grade inflation. Okay, very hard to interpret it, and I'm going to walk on eggshells here because I don't want to say anything rude about anybody. I just want to make a point. Departments, so each observation, each marker here is a different department. The departments that serve the most underrepresented minority students and serve the most low-income students offer the highest grades in their classes. The ones that are not serving those students in as large a number offer much lower grades. Partly that reflects, I believe, the fact that, and I've shown you some evidence of it, that the departments are actively actually keeping these less well-prepared students out, or some of the less well-prepared students out, by keeping the grades high, low, to make sure you can't cross the GPA barriers. And partly, of course, it is a response by faculty to the fact that you have so many students and too few resources to grade qualitative work in serious ways and offer the kind of serious feedback that is required to get improvement. And sometimes it just becomes easier to not inconvenience the students and offer them the grade. There are a wide range of ways to interpret this, but that's more or less my sense of it. Okay, in any case, well, if all I want to establish is that we have separate and unequal, we've got that too. And these slopes were much smaller in 2000. This is 2016 data. Okay. I'll also say that this type of graph here on the expected earnings given majors, we've done it for the national level. I can show that to you in question time if you want, and you see the same thing happening at the national level. We've done it at the national level, restricting it to public universities and restricting it to private universities. It happens in both, this widening gap, but it is much worse at public universities, which, as we've documented, are the ones using major restrictions to bridge budget gaps. So that's where we have it. Now, that's the story so far. It's important to talk about possible solutions to the problem. I'm going to end with just by leaving the slide up so you can think about them. But I want to be quite clear about this. Each of these symptomatic solutions that would treat the symptoms is doing just that. I tend to think of it as moving deck chairs on the Titanic. Each of them carries a very significant cost one way or another, or is politically unpalatable, or requires additional resources that we don't have, or would reduce the quality of education yet further in exchange for some more fairness. But these are all basically alternatives to the system of major restrictions we have now. Like I said, I think this is moving deck chairs on the Titanic. I think the real solution is to stop charging at icebergs. And the way you do that is to actually restore state funding. You cannot have a world-class public university system where you systematically, year after year after year, take away the funding that's required to ensure that students get to enroll in classes of their choice without worrying about the financial consequences. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor. I love all of the conversations happening in the chat. I was also a global studies major when I went to UCSB, so good to see a lot of you in here. I'm going to scroll all the way up because we had one question early on. So thank you to everyone who asked questions as well. One of the questions was, are the graduation standards the same in 2020 versus 1990?
Difficult one to answer. I wasn't here in 1990, so I don't have a qualitative feel. And I don't know what the quality of the work that was being turned in was against the grades that students got. So I don't know for sure. But I want to show you one slide that puts some of this in perspective, right? One of the arguments that people sometimes make is, the whole, oh, all right, you want an equal society, but do you really want an airplane pilot who can't do the math, right? So maybe if it's pilot school, we shouldn't allow them in. It's absolutely fine, right? If you look at the SAT, ACT scores of our students as over time, they've continued to improve. Now, people who know this literature better than me tell me that you can treat these as intertemporally comparable, which tells us the quality of UC students coming in has been increasing over time, which to me suggests that the kids who are now kicking out of the high demand majors would have qualified for them in the past. So the argument that we're going to let in pilots are going to fly planes into hills by refusing to screen them is not accurate. Now, what is that? So if you couple that with the fact that the grades have been going up, now I've got an inferential problem. I can't tell you whether the grades went up because the students got better or the grades went up because the standards got lower. I don't know. Simple answer. But nor does anyone else. That's also important to know.
Mm-hmm. This one, someone else may have answered in the chat as well, but was there a wage difference between economics majors at Davis versus Santa Barbara? This may have been in reference to a specific slide.
I don't know the answer to that. We didn't look at that. I'll make a note and we'll look it up. And if whoever wants to know the answer writes to me in a week, we should be able to tell them.
Okay. All right. And then we have some new questions coming in. Someone's asking, what is global studies, which I feel like several of us could answer, but I'll get your professional opinion.
my professional opinion on what is global study. Well, it's the interdisciplinary study of globalization, which and of forces that operate globally. It's what happens. It's what you get when you take area studies and make it international, and you take international studies and you descend to the nation state and you say, we're interested not just in the operation of nation states, but all sorts of transnational actors like universities, terrorist outfits, religious movements, corporations, international supply chains, etc. So it's basically, it's the interdisciplinary study of globalization. I think that's the best simple answer I can give you.
Someone also put a lengthy answer in the chat. Thank you, Benjamin, if anybody else wants to check that out. And then we have another question that is, what is the justification for imposing major restrictions? Why do universities or departments do that?
Okay. There are, okay, so first let's start with the why do we do it? Why we do it, my view on the inside is that we do it because we're being asked to square a circle, which is, here are all of these students who want to major in your field. No, you can't have the resources needed to teach them properly. Now deal with it. And I think that part of the response is to say, so one of the reasons is, well, we can't, so we won't. So let's figure out a way to decide who's going to do it. So that's one reason they get put in. The other reason that is given, and we are required to provide when we put in place major restrictions, is to explain why it is that clearing the particular hurdles that we propose will ensure that the students are fit for upper division work. And so that's the rationale given for it. That's the reason why pre-major restrictions exist more in STEM fields, because those cases are easier to make. And they're easier to make because they often are valid. I mean, there's not much doubt about that. What I question is why you couldn't make the same case for an English major. If you have a student who's struggling to string sentences together, will they survive in an upper division poetry class? Will they produce good work? Maybe not. But at that point, we have to ask the question, then why do we treat these fields differently, right? And so the legitimate reason, I think, for doing it is because we don't have the pedagogical resources available to teach you well. And so that's what we do. I should also say global studies now has a pre-major. And so while we were doing all of this work, I was actually in the process as the undergrad director in global studies of putting a pre-major together. And the university has a pretty rigorous process for reviewing them to try and make sure that there is not an undue burden. We have to show that there isn't. And in our case, the GPA cap is so low that it's not going to kick anyone out on the basis of prior preparation. We made sure of that. We require people to take a year of history to ensure that they're sufficiently interested in the world as we understand it to merit the time spent in global studies. So it's a different kind of pre-major restriction, but these are the main arguments that are advanced and required to make this happen.
Awesome. If anyone put a question in the beginning of the chat that I missed, feel free to type it again. It's kind of hard to scroll up, but thank you to everyone who's putting questions in. Next, we have, with the change in UC leadership in the past few months, will we see a strong push to increase state funding, or is that going to be squarely with the legislature?
A, I don't know. B, there is a dance we've been playing as far as the legislature goes. I mean, the dance has gone on for a very, very long time. The legislature keeps saying to us, take more students, take less money from us, and teach them. And then the UC comes back and says, but how much less money, and so we negotiate, we go back and forth. We've quite clearly not been on the winning end of those negotiations. So what will happen going forward, I don't know. But I think we are getting to a point where we need to start being less reticent about saying, folks, you don't get more for less, you get less for less. If you want a public university system that is going to take more of your family's money and give your kids less educational choice, these are the policies you pursue.
Definitely, definitely. Someone has said, what are the first steps to solve the root of the problem? State funding, message our state legislatures, get the study out, complain to UCSB.
Well, so so complaining to UCSB, so it's not the case that UCSB is systematically trying to make these things happen the way that they are happening, right? UCSB is trying to make the best of a bad situation. We don't have the funds, so we try to make do with it. Ucop will say the same thing. To me, I think what we need is a full court press. It's sort of an all of the above. We've got to get everybody pushing at the legislature, pushing in the press, right? And basically make the argument that, if you want a public university system that works for your kids, we're going to have to fund it, and the money is going to have to come from the top. As far as this study goes, we've put out a brief that Ucop has already published. So Ucop acknowledges everything that we are saying here, or at least they have permitted us to publish a brief on the letterhead. They know it, they see it, they have not disputed it. I don't think you're going to get pushback on the facts at the local level. What you're getting pushback on is the priorities at the budgeting level, up top. And that's what we got to fix. I wish I knew more as a political scientist about how to do it. But my sense is you don't get it by keeping quiet and refusing to admit that there is a problem, and that it is important that middle-class families start to hear about this and understand that this is what's in store for their kids, because frankly, that's who the political parties are going to be listening to, right? We can make the working class case. It's very important that we do and be attentive locally. If you want to, win in the political game, you've got to get the people who have the most political voice on your side.
Awesome. And that kind of leads into another question someone had. What reception has your research received from UCOP?
Well, my collaborator works at UCOP. They've seen the work and they allowed us to publish it, which means they get it and they get that there's a problem. As far as, look, there is a tendency when you get into the sort of politics of austerity for people to start looking around and saying, oh, this one's getting more than I'm getting, and that one's getting less than I'm getting, and what should I say, and who do I complain to, and this is not fair. That's not going to help us in the long run, right? In the long run, what we need is a viable coalition where we're all singing from the same lead sheet and making the argument to the legislature that, look, one of the things that is essentially has been done in California in the name of a fairly progressive cause is to shift funding from the UCs to the Cal States and the CSUs. And there's an argument that can be made for that. But if that's what you want to do, then own it, right? Then say, we are interested in giving Californian families a CSU education, not a UC education. And we'll, and if that's what you want to do, then my suggestion would be, let's maintain some specialization, fund the CSUs properly to do it, and stop asking us to take more students and earn more tuition dollars to do it, and let us be a research university. And provide the benefits of a research university education to our students, which are substantial. Those are different. Those are benefits you get by selecting research faculty who will work closely with students to train them to do things that are research oriented, as opposed to hiring excellent teaching instructors. What I object to is this business of, well, now we'll turn the UC over to hiring just teaching faculty in the UC to serve larger and larger number of students. It doesn't make much sense to me. So, sorry, long answer to a short question.
This one's a good applicable one. How should this kind of information be communicated to first-year students so that they can make educated choices about their major and so they can plan strategically?
That's a great question. So I think I think I think it needs to be discussed in first year courses, right? So we have general education classes, and it certainly would be helpful to have people who know about these things come into first year classes and talk to students and advise them on this. So that's something we can do. I've been working. So Chris Newfield, who's just recently retired from the English department. So he and Zach and me and some others, we're producing a book for young people and their families trying to make these sorts of decisions. And we try to lay some of this out for them in there. So we're trying to get the message out in those ways. Just as soon as we get done with this research and get the papers out, we'll of course hit the press. And then beyond that, you should know that it isn't that nothing is being done. If you look around, if you look up, Charlie Hale, our Dean of Social Science, and the other deans of social sciences from Irvine and I believe Santa Cruz have been editorializing about this sort of stuff all over the place. So a lot of us are trying. Yeah, and at some point, it's a question of how to do it in a more organized way. Contact representatives, etc. At this point, I got to beg off because I'm a statistician, an economist. I see a problem, I can identify it. I don't know much about the political organizing, but we've got work to do, and we need to talk about it. I think talking about it on campus is a great place to start.
Awesome. I'm going to do 2 more questions in the interest of time. I know some of you haven't had your questions answered, but maybe we can connect about how to get those questions answered at the end of the talk. So second to last question, would you recommend that high school students with lower GPAs start at a junior college in order to increase the foundational competencies and then enter UCSB as a junior?
I don't have a rigorous answer to that. And the reason we don't have a rigorous answer to that is because you really need sort of an experiment to be able to answer that. You need to have somebody who's come out of high school and is either randomly assigned to try to get in directly as a freshman or randomly assigned to a transfer. And we don't have that. We can't ethically create that. So that's something we have actually been thinking about is, and Zach in particular was, I believe, has wanted to work on it, but we can't figure out the design for a study that would answer that question. My sense is, so I don't know about coming in as a transfer. That's complex. But if you're just asking as a teacher, what's my advice? I've got some lacuna in math. I would say, yeah, maybe try to make them up before you come into college. Sure, because it's cheaper, and you develop the skills, and you can come and take the math class again, show that you know the stuff. On an individual basis, that's a reasonable way to go. As a society, that's a bad way to be structuring our education system. It's a wasteful duplication of resources and student time.
Great. And then our last question, how might an argument for increasing state funds account for the increased availability and accessibility of online courses? And then they note the quality of which is steadily increasing. And maybe you can throw in some of your online course experience from this last year.
Yeah, okay. So I've been spared the worst of it so far. I teach my first big online class in spring. I've taught small online classes. And because these classes were small, they were actually some of my best teaching experiences at UCSB so far, because I got to teach 10 students at once. And we could do all kinds of things there. The online-offline distinction matters more in some fields than in others. In general, what we know is that, so what I'd caution is that going online doing a good course online doesn't take any less work than doing a good course offline in person. So it doesn't save you on any labor. It does, of course, make some things possible during COVID, or if there are, if you want to start serving students who can't afford to live close to campus, et cetera, that stuff starts to be helpful. But the idea that by putting things on course online, you can make them massive and that this will solve problems, I think it's wrong. And it's dangerously wrong. The experience with MOOCs has been that MOOCs don't work. Students don't complete them. The learning outcomes are not very good. So that just isn't a solution. It's one that gets bandied around, but I don't see how it's going to work for most fields. There may be some fields where you can do it for students that are self-starters that have the basic skills in place. But if you're trying to do things like remedial anything, remedial writing, remedial math, the sort of stuff that we have to do with half our students in the first year, you can't do that massive and you can't do that online. So this problem isn't getting solved by that.
Awesome. Great answer. So just to address a couple of comments in the chat, Eddie, you just said, could you create an alumni forum? So there's something called Gaucho Network. It was mentioned on the first slide. It's essentially LinkedIn, but just for alumni, but it's a really great place to connect. It's gauchonetwork.com. So if anybody wants to join that, it's only for alumni. There's job postings, there's mentorship opportunities, and lots of things like that. I'll also include a link in the follow-up email that I'll be sending out tomorrow or Monday to all of you. So great question, thanks for asking. Someone mentioned the UC Advocacy Network, which is something I recommend everyone sign up. It's a great way to learn more about advocating for UC funding. It was really promoted during the election in November, so I would definitely look into that if you're interested in helping out more. Thank you all for coming. This, as I said, this was our first virtual networking session or virtual Profs the Pub of 2021. There will be another one at the end of March, and then All Gaucho Reunion, our reunion weekend, is moving virtual this year, of course. So there will be one during that week. It's going to be on April 21st, and it's featuring Professor Tanya Israel. She's great. She did a talk about 2 years ago in person for us. So she's awesome, and she just wrote a book. So there's information about that currently on our website. And then I'll also include some more information if I have it at the time about next month. Otherwise, you guys will get an email about it. Thank you all for coming. If you have any feedback, there will be a form to fill out in the email as well. And I'll connect with Professor Mehta about options for if people had questions that weren't answered and how they can best go about getting those answered. I'll drop my email in the chat right now in case anyone has a question about the event or anything else. But thank you so much for coming.